Okay, hello and welcome to our presentation. Today we'll be talking about a different story, how conservative narratives diverge between Twitter and Parler. My name is Regina Catipon and I am joined by Dr. Onur Savas. So we'll be talking a bit of background before we really dive in. If you remember, on January 6th of this year, there was an insurrection at the US Capitol. And this is related to many conspiracies around the US presidential election. Now, some of this insurrection could be attributed to a really chaotic information landscape. Not only were election conspiracies election conspiracies were a major part of the information landscape at this time period. There's also pandemic misinformation, which the WHO deemed as a secondary infodemic. Now, one of the major players in this infodemic and chaotic landscape was Parler. Facebook and Twitter began to moderate misinformation around this time. And Parler, which was a free speech platform that started in 2018, grew in popularity as a response. It was marketed as an unferreted platform for speech. So what is Parler exactly? Well, as you can see from the slide, Parler is actually a knockoff of Twitter in many different ways. On one section, you see an example tweet, and its Parler brother would be a parlay. And it's quite similar. There are different ways to engage with it. Tweets are parlays, there's a timeline of posts, and instead of retweets, you have echoes. And it started with about, it's said to have had about 10 million users following the US presidential election. But then it went through a period of moderation where it was banned from the App Store and AWS refused to host it. It is now back online as of February 2021. But we thought that this would be an interesting space for study. So our overall research question is, in what ways do narratives diverge on Twitter versus Parler for conservative public figures? We broke out this question into 3 sub-questions. Is the content from conservative public figures more or less biased on Twitter or Parler? 2, what websites are commonly shared and which of these sites are the most influential? Does this also change by platform? And 3, within the same group of conservative public figures, how similar or divergent are the topics across platforms? So we looked at a particular sample population of public figures that maintained accounts on both Parler and Twitter. You should know that this sample skews US politically right and hyper-nationalist. We looked at a variety of methods. The first was the distribution of media bias scores, and we'll talk about how we were able to collect those scores. The second is through citation networks, and then we took a look at PageRank influence of the different sources cited. And then we also took a look at topics using LDA models. So in terms of data collection, we had a 2-fold process for Twitter and Parler. So for Twitter, we used the authentication API. We did a timeline collection. So all posts from a user since the user joined the platform, and we collected a total of 28,000 tweets. For Parler, we used the headless browser Selenium to scrape the website, and we had about 1,800 parlays. And the timeline for both platforms was all posts from these users until December 22nd, 2020. Now, there are many data challenges for this. So like I mentioned before, there was active moderation during data collection. AWS actually shut down Parler. And so there was this period of time where we were trying to work around these the data access issues. So taking a look at the media bias ratings, which is a major component of our work, we extracted URLs from each post for both Twitter and Parler. And then we did domain matching to news sites. And then we use that domain matching to compute the bias. So using media bias fact check, we had the range of extreme left to extreme right, and that went from -10 to +10. The ratings are based on the US political rating system. We have a deeply divided two-party system with in-group variation. And the media bias fact check system that we used here has been used previously by other researchers. For example, University of Michigan, they created the IFINIS index. Just on one example here, you can see from the Pew graph that there's a lot of variation within the right and the left. So there are liberals, there are Democrats within that same left side. And then on the right, we have new era enterprisers, which includes like libertarians, and then we also have core conservatives on the right. So that's just some context for the US political system. So to answer our first question, we took a look at whether or not shared content is more biased on Twitter or Parler. We found that the distribution of media bias scores tended to skew more right for Parler than Twitter. This indicates that on average, websites shared on Parler more extreme right news. But this aligns with the current characterization of Parler as a haven for far right speech. We did find, however, that the characterization did not hold true for every political public figure. So here's a few examples. The first is Senator Ted Cruz. He was bimodal on Twitter, and he tended to lean right. And then on Parler, he actually moved more extreme. This is the distribution for Rand Paul. He is a libertarian voice within the Republican Party. He's also bimodal on Twitter, so he showed both left and right content. But on Parler, he moved again to the extreme right. This is an example from Governor Kristi Noem of South Dakota. So she is politically left on Twitter, which is really divergent from her sharing patterns on Parler, where she is very extreme right. It's an interesting divergence that we see with this particular public figure. And then for the Fox News host, John Hannity, there was no change. And we looked further into this and we saw that he seems to only share on his own website. So kind of makes sense that there is no change. We also took a look at what sources were influential on Twitter versus on Parler. And we created citation graphs through Python's NetworkX package. This is the Twitter graph that's been filtered to at least 1 degree. We had about 600 nodes and about 900 edges. And we color coded the graph based on community. And then each of the nodes are sized by relative influence. So just to talk a little bit more about the community clustering, we use the Gervin-Newman community detection algorithm, and we found 4 distinct communities. One was very large at 500 nodes, and then we had some much smaller communities at 60, 40, 42, and 4. And then we took a look at the top 2 communities and looked at the average media bias, and we found them to be divergent. So in the really large community, the average media bias seemed to be 3, and in the smaller community of 63, the average media bias score was around 1. So let's take a look at Parler now. On Parler, we had a much smaller data set. So of course, our graph is also going to be smaller to reflect that. We had about 125 nodes, 168 edges, and this is also filtered to at least 1 degree. And then we color coded here by source or by user. And again, node size is equal to the influence. Now let's talk a little bit more about what influence means here. So PageRank was calculated based on incoming connections to a node with respect to its edge weight. So how often, in this case, a source was shared by users. We took a look at the most commonly shared links and the influential sources on Parler. And we found that on Parler, which is here in the green, that there were both both politically right and politically left sources. So for example, you can see that there's Newsweek, the New York Times, CNBC, and there's also Washington Examiner, Fox News, and Breitbart. Now, if we look at Twitter, the top sources in the Twitter graph were almost exclusively right-leaning or extreme right. There are some exceptions with YouTube and Facebook, but these are more platforms. You can see that the top sources on Twitter, at least by influence, were Hannity.com, the Old School Patriot, and Fox News. So we had a few interpretations for what this might mean. Why is it that users were more likely to share diverse news sources on Parler versus Twitter, even if on average they tended to share more extreme content on Parler? One explanation could be that Twitter has a variety of political communities, so conservatives may feel compelled to evangelize to this crowd, try to push a certain conservative or extreme right message at higher rates. Another interpretation is that liberal content might be less likely to receive engagement on Parler. There might be some combination of these two, and it may not be an and/or situation. So we also took a look at the content of these posts, and we did that using the LDA models. And we wanted to ask, how do topics diverge by social platform? What we find here is that LDA topic models were useful to characterize the content of those posts, and these are generated using LTK and Jensen. And we calculated coherence scores for both Twitter and Parler, and we found that they peaked around the number 10. So these are the topics that we found for Twitter, and we saw that there was a wide range of subjects. These subjects included COVID-19, the election, accusations of censorship and foreign policy. And we'll show Parler's topic models right after this, but in comparison, Twitter seemed to have more variety, and that makes sense considering the data size. I wanted to highlight topic 4, which shows mentions of Hunter Biden quite explicitly. And then when we look at Parler here, we see that the focus tended to be much more on elections and conspiracies, but they also had a topic focused on Hunter Biden. And through manual inspection, we found terms like USB handoff and full suitcase, which were stories, details of the New York Post story, which was this big quote expose on the Hunter Biden scandal. So what we wanted to do was to see how similar this shared topic was on Twitter versus Parler. And though they had the same Hunter Biden focus, they were strongly decorrelated at a 0.98 index using the Jacquard distance method. And this decorrelation across platforms, I think that indicates that even though users are talking about similar topics, they have conversations that diverge radically on Parler versus Twitter. Now, there might be some reasons for this. It could be due to active moderation by Twitter and no moderation at all on Parler, but it's still, I think, indicative of, or answers to an extent, our questions around how do narratives diverge by one platform or another. So in conclusion, we found that conservative political figures do share content on Parler that leans more extreme right. This does align with current characterizations of the platform as a haven for conservative right groups. However, liberal sources are more likely to be ranked as influential on Parler than on Twitter. And our topic model analysis indicates that moderation may be one driver of divergent behavior. So if we took a look at future work, there are so many questions to be answered here. For example, are users more likely to share left-leaning content on Twitter because of the diversity of political communities on Twitter? Or is it because right-leaning content tends to be moderated at a higher rate? Does Parler content lean extreme right because the platform is unmoderated? Or is it because such content drives user engagement? So there are some implications for internet speech in this work. Future segregation of social media platforms such as Gab, Vote, Parler, and others may reinforce echo chambers. And there's also a lot of questions around US Section 230 and the European Union's GDPR, in which it's unknown how to best regulate content, who is responsible for speech on their platforms. And then I think another extension of this work could be an analysis of the effects of cancel culture and how big tech consolidation may affect hosting and content moderation. And with that, I just want to say thank you very much. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to me or Dr. Savas.